Have you ever noticed how fast a conversation can die? Not with a fight, not with a mistake, just with a pause, a few polite questions, a short answer, a nod, then silence. The kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your hands, your face, your breathing. The kind that makes you want to reach for your phone, look away, escape. Most people think they run out of things to say because they are awkward, or boring, or too anxious. But that is rarely the truth. What usually happens is simpler than that. You were never taught how conversations actually work, so you walk into rooms trying to be interesting when the real secret has very little to do with being impressive. It has more to do with noticing, listening, knowing where to place your attention when the moment starts slipping away. Because the people who never seem to run out of things to say are not performing magic, they are following patterns. And once you see those patterns, you stop fearing silence the way you used to. The first mistake most people make in conversation is thinking the pressure is on them to perform. So they walk into an interaction like they are stepping onto a stage. They start monitoring themselves. Am I sounding smart enough? Am I talking too much? Do I seem nervous? Was that answer too short, too long, too dull? And the more they watch themselves, the less they actually notice the other person. That is where conversations begin to collapse. Because a real conversation is not a performance. It is not a speech. It is not a test of how charming you can be in real time. It is two people discovering whether there is something alive between them, something worth staying with for a few minutes longer. And that changes everything. When you stop asking, "How am I coming across?" and start asking, "What is happening here?" your whole posture shifts. You become less stiff, less desperate, less trapped inside your own head. You begin to see that most awkwardness is not caused by a lack of personality. It is caused by divided attention. Part of you is in the room. The other part is in self-defense. And when you live there, in that split, every silence feels dangerous. I think a lot of people over 40 understand this in a deeper way than younger people do, even if they do not always say it out loud. By this point in life, you have lived enough to know what it feels like to carry invisible weight into a room. You have had years where you were overlooked, years where you had to be competent, responsible, composed, years where maybe you became the one who handled things, fixed things, endured things. Somewhere along the way, conversations stopped being play and started feeling like labor. You stopped entering rooms lightly. You entered with history. And history has a voice. It whispers things while the other person is talking. Be careful. Do not say too much. Do not look foolish. Do not let them see you reaching. Keep it together. Stay polished. Stay safe. But safety has a cost. When you make safety your goal in a conversation, curiosity disappears. And without curiosity, words dry up fast. Because now you are not responding to what is actually being said. You are trying to manage an impression. You are trimming your thoughts before they can breathe. You are editing yourself in real time. And that makes people tired, deeply tired. Not because talking is hard, because self-protection is exhausting. This is why some of the most intelligent, experienced, thoughtful people can still feel strangely helpless in ordinary conversation. Not in a boardroom, not when giving advice, not when discussing facts or responsibilities, but in simple human moments. A dinner table, a birthday party, a hallway after church, a neighbor at the mailbox, a spouse after a long day, a grown child calling unexpectedly. The places where no script is handed to you. That is where many people freeze. Not because they have nothing inside them, but because they have too much happening inside them at once. And the first step to never running out of things to say is not learning some clever trick. It is learning how to come back into the room, back into the moment, back into the person in front of you, back into the actual texture of what is being said. Think about how differently life feels when someone is truly with you. Not waiting to impress you, not trying to top your story, not scanning for an escape route. Just there, present, listening with their face, their body, their silence. You can feel it instantly. It calms something in you. It invites something out of you. That is what good conversationalists do. Not by force, not by technique alone, but by giving attention that feels rare in a distracted world. And this is the part most people miss. Attention creates language. When you are truly paying attention, the next thing to say usually appears on its own. Maybe not as a perfect sentence, maybe not as something dazzling, but as something real. A question, an observation, a memory, a small connection. A detail you noticed, something honest enough to keep the thread alive. But when attention leaves, panic enters. And panic always makes the room smaller. Suddenly, there are only two things left: you and your fear of getting it wrong. That is why the goal is not to become endlessly entertaining. The goal is to become more available to the moment, to the person, to the thread hidden inside what they are saying. Most conversations do not die because there is no possible next sentence. They die because no one is listening closely enough to hear where the next sentence lives. And once you understand that, silence starts to change shape. It stops feeling like proof that you are failing. It starts feeling like a doorway. A small pause before something more honest can be said. One of the quiet truths about conversation is that people rarely remember your exact words. They remember how it felt to be with you. They remember whether they felt rushed or received, judged or understood, managed or met. And that matters more than most people realize, especially after 40, when life has already taught you how rare it is to be around someone who is fully there. By this age, most people have had enough shallow interactions to know the difference. They have sat through conversations where no one was really listening. They have answered questions that were only asked out of politeness. They have smiled through exchanges that looked warm on the outside but felt empty underneath. So when someone meets them with real attention, it lands differently. It feels rare. And that is why this next principle matters so much. If you want to never run out of things to say, stop trying to create interesting conversation from scratch. Learn how to draw it out of the other person. That changes everything. Most people enter conversations carrying the wrong role. They think they need to supply energy, fill every gap, tell good stories, avoid awkwardness, and somehow stay likable the whole time. That is too much weight for any interaction. A better role is this. Notice what the other person has already given you and stay with it long enough for it to open. Because people are always giving you more than they seem to be giving. A passing comment, a choice of words, a facial expression, a small laugh that does not quite match the sentence, a detail dropped casually that probably is not casual at all. This is where deeper conversation begins, not in the spectacular. In the overlooked, someone says, "It was a busy week." That sentence can die in 2 seconds, or you can stay with it. Busy how? Good busy or draining busy? What took most of your energy? Has it been like that for a while? Now you are no longer standing on the surface, you are dipping below it. And the beauty of this is that you do not need to be brilliant to do it. You just need to care long enough not to skate past the first layer. That is what so many people do by habit. They move too quickly, they hear a sentence and rush to the next one. They grab the headline but miss the story. They assume there is nothing deeper because they have trained themselves to live in summaries. But people are not summaries. A person can say, "I'm fine" in 10 different ways, and each one means something different. A person can mention work, marriage, retirement, health, children, loneliness, aging, money, regret, hope, all in half a sentence if you know how to listen. And this is where conversation becomes less about speaking and more about sensing. Sensing where there is life, where there is emotion, where there is tension, where something in the person seems to lean forward without saying so directly. If you can notice that, you will almost never be empty-handed in a conversation. Because the next thing to say is often hidden inside the part that carried the most feeling. This is especially true with people who are not naturally expressive. By 40, many people are carrying entire inner worlds behind controlled faces. They have learned restraint. They have learned how to package complicated lives into neat little sentences. They have learned how to say, "Things are good," when what they really mean is, "I'm tired," in ways I don't even know how to explain. So if you want better conversation, learn to hear the difference between the polished answer and the human one underneath it. Not aggressively, not like an interrogation, just gently. With enough patience that the other person can decide whether they want to go a little deeper. That patience is powerful, because most people are used to being interrupted, redirected, or half-heard. They are used to being skimmed. So when you stay with their thought a little longer than expected, you give them something uncommon. You give them room. And room changes people. It lets them remember what they actually think, what they actually feel, what they were about to say before life taught them to keep it brief. That is why a good question can do more than fill silence. It can restore someone to themselves, not every time, but often enough to matter. And the good news is, it usually begins with one simple discipline. Stay with the thing that has energy. If the person lights up when they mention their garden, stay there. If their voice changes when they mention their daughter, stay there. If they sigh when they mention work, stay there. You do not need 100 topics. You need one real thread and the willingness to follow it. That is how conversations deepen, not by jumping wider, but by going one layer lower. And once a person feels seen, conversation no longer feels like work. It begins to carry itself. There is another reason people run out of things to say, and it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with speed. Modern life trains people to move fast through everything. Fast opinions, fast reactions, fast messages, fast conclusions, even fast empathy. Someone starts telling a story, and before they finish, the mind is already reaching for a response, a comparison, a solution, a joke, anything to keep the moment moving. But good conversation does not grow well in rushed soil. It needs space. It needs unhurried attention. It needs a person willing to let a moment breathe before grabbing it. This matters even more after 40, because by then, most people are carrying crowded inner lives. Responsibilities, memories, quiet disappointments, things they no longer talk about. Things they thought life would solve by now, but did not. So when they say something small, it often comes from somewhere much larger. And if you respond too quickly, you can miss the whole thing. A person says, "I don't travel much anymore." That can sound like a dead-end sentence, but it may hold many stories. Maybe money got tight. Maybe their spouse got sick. Maybe they got tired. Maybe life became smaller. Maybe they lost the person they used to travel with. You do not know yet. And that is the point. Conversations become richer the moment you stop assuming you already understand what a sentence means. When you become slower inside, people start revealing more. Not because you forced it out of them, because your pace made room for it. This is one of the most underrated social skills in the world. Not rushing the meaning, not rushing to answer, not rushing to interpret, not rushing to fix, not rushing to prove you relate, just staying there long enough for the person's words to become fully themselves. There is a kind of maturity in that, and people feel it. You have probably met someone like this, someone who is not loud or flashy, but when they speak with you, you feel calmer, less hurried, less pressured to perform. That is not shallow charisma. That is presence, and presence has weight. It slows the conversation down in the best possible way. This is why some of the most memorable people are not the most entertaining. They are the ones who make you feel safe enough to become a little more honest than you planned to be. That safety is built in small ways, through tone, through timing, through the way they do not interrupt the vulnerable part with something clever, through the way they let your thought finish arriving before they touch it. That kind of conversation is rare now. Because people are overstimulated and underpresent. And maybe that includes you. Maybe for years, you have been living slightly ahead of yourself, managing time, stress, people, impressions, always bracing for the next thing. If that is true, then of course conversation feels harder than it should. You are trying to connect from a nervous system that rarely gets to exhale. So part of learning to never run out of things to say is not verbal at all. It is physical. You learn to slow your body, so your mind can slow, so your attention can deepen, so your words can come from somewhere steadier. Sometimes before a conversation even begins, the wisest thing you can do is soften your pace a little. Breathe once without rushing it. Unclench your jaw. Let your shoulders drop. Stop trying to arrive polished. Just arrive present. That changes more than people realize. Because words are not separate from state. If your body feels threatened, your speech will tighten. If your body feels hurried, your listening will narrow. If your body feels guarded, your questions will stay shallow. But when your body settles even slightly, your range opens. You hear more. You notice more. You become less afraid of pauses. And then language starts returning in a more natural way. This is also why silence does not need to be your enemy. Most people treat silence like a fire that must be put out immediately. The second it appears, they rush to say something, anything, just to kill the discomfort. But forced words almost always make a conversation feel thinner, not deeper. A brief silence can do something beautiful. It can show that what was said mattered. It can give both people a second to feel it. It can invite a more honest next sentence. Think about the best conversations you have ever had. They were probably not non-stop streams of perfect lines. More likely, they had rhythm, speech, pause, truth, pause, laughter, pause. A story that took its time, a question that landed. That is not broken conversation. That is human conversation. So if you want to become someone who never runs out of things to say, stop worshiping speed. Depth is not fast. Trust is not fast. Meaning is not fast. And what feels like having nothing to say is often just a moment that is not opened yet. If you stay with it calmly, it usually tells you where to go next. At a certain point in life, many people stop struggling with conversation on the surface and start struggling with it underneath. Outwardly, they do fine. They know how to be polite. They know the standard questions. They know how to smile, nod, and keep things socially acceptable. They can get through dinners, meetings, holidays, reunions. But inside, something feels missing. The exchange feels thin, predictable, drained before it even begins. And this is where another hidden problem appears. Many people are not running out of words. They are running out of sincerity. Not because they are dishonest, because they have spent too many years speaking from habit. The older you get, the easier it is to fall into conversational autopilot. You ask what everybody asks. You say what everybody says. You use familiar phrases because they are safe and socially smooth. How have you been? Busy as always. Can't complain. Same old, same old. None of those phrases are wrong. But they often keep both people outside the real house. And after 40, there is often a quiet hunger for something more substantial than that. Not dramatic, not confessional, just real. Something that feels like two human beings are actually in the room, not just two social roles exchanging approved lines. That is why one of the strongest ways to keep a conversation alive is to bring a little more truth into it, carefully, naturally, without making it heavy for no reason. Truth gives conversation oxygen. It could be something as small as saying, "Honestly, I've been trying to slow down a bit lately," instead of "same old, just busy." Or, "I'm still figuring that out," instead of pretending you have a polished answer. Or, "That's a good question. I haven't thought about that in a while." Those kinds of responses do something subtle but powerful. They invite the other person to step out of performance too. Because most people do not need you to impress them. They need permission to stop being polished for a minute. They need a signal that this conversation can hold something more than surface maintenance. And the strange thing is, the more honest you are in a grounded way, the less likely you are to run out of things to say. Because now, you are no longer speaking from script. You are speaking from what is actually true in the moment. And truth has more branches than performance ever does. This does not mean oversharing. Being real is not the same as unloading. It is not turning every conversation into therapy. Maturity knows proportion. But proportion does not mean emptiness. You can be measured and still be real, quiet and still be real, thoughtful and still be real. Some of the deepest warmth in conversation comes from people who say simple things with no armor around them. I thought this season of life would feel different. I'm grateful, but I'm more tired than I expected. I still get awkward in situations like this. Those lines land because they are modest, but alive. And they create something most people are starving for without naming it: recognition. The feeling of hearing another person say something you have felt but never quite put into words. That is often what makes someone memorable, not their confidence, not their storytelling, their honesty, their ability to say one plain thing that cuts through the social wallpaper and touches something real. Especially in midlife and beyond, people are carrying layers that daily conversation often ignores. Marriages with history in them, careers that did not become what they once imagined, children growing up, parents aging, bodies changing, gratitude mixed with fatigue. And yet, most conversations stay in the weather, the schedule, the harmless update. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you stay there all the time, you start to feel lonely even while talking. That is why sincerity matters so much. It is one of the bridges between social contact and real connection. And once that bridge appears, words come easier. Because now both people have something to work with, a real thought, a real feeling, a real question. Not just information. Information rarely carries a conversation for long. Meaning does. So if you find yourself running out of things to say, do not only ask, what question should I use next? Also ask, am I still speaking from the safe version of myself? Am I giving this conversation anything real to hold on to? Because sometimes the conversation is not dying from lack of technique. Sometimes it is starving for truth. There is another shift that changes conversation completely, and most people do not notice it until much later in life. It is the shift from trying to be interesting to becoming interested. That sounds small. It is not. When you are trying to be interesting, your attention keeps circling back to yourself, your stories, your timing, your image. Whether what you just said landed well, whether you seem sharp enough, warm enough, confident enough. Even when you are being kind, part of your mind is still managing the reflection of yourself in the other person's eyes. And that creates friction, because self-consciousness is noisy. It eats up attention that could have gone toward curiosity. But when you become genuinely interested, something relaxes. You stop trying to manufacture connection and start discovering it. You stop asking, how do I keep this conversation alive? And start asking, who is this person really? That question opens more doors than technique ever will. The truth is, almost every person becomes more interesting the moment you stop relating to them as a category. Not a neighbor, not a coworker, not someone at church, not my spouse, who I already know, not my brother who always says the same things, not another person at this event. A real person, with contradictions, with private history, with losses you cannot see, with tastes, regrets, hopes, strange habits, old wounds, unfinished thoughts. Even familiar people contain hidden rooms, sometimes especially familiar people. A lot of long relationships go stale conversationally, not because there is nothing left to say, but because both people start assuming they already know the whole map. They stop asking. They stop noticing. They stop being surprised. The person becomes a summary in their mind, and once that happens, conversation gets replaced by logistics. What time are we leaving? Did you call them back? What do you want for dinner? How was your day? Fine. Yours? Busy. And just like that, two lives can sit inches apart and remain emotionally far away. Curiosity repairs that. Not fake curiosity, not performative interest. Real curiosity has warmth in it. It listens for what has changed. It notices what was not there last month, last year, last season of life. It asks questions that are not efficient, but revealing. What has been on your mind lately? What has been feeling heavier than usual? What are you looking forward to right now? What feels different to you these days? Those questions do not force depth. They invite it. And invitation matters, because people open more naturally when they do not feel handled, when they do not feel analyzed, when they do not feel like the conversation has an agenda. Curiosity without pressure is one of the most attractive qualities a person can bring into a room. It says, without saying, "You do not need to impress me. I am here to discover you." That kind of attention is rare, and because it is rare, it creates momentum. People start giving more, not because you are brilliant, because they feel your interest is real. This is also why conversations often improve with age, when people stop performing youth and start valuing substance. At some point, the polished social self becomes exhausting. You get tired of saying the acceptable thing, tired of staying at the surface, tired of leaving interactions untouched. And slowly, if you are paying attention, you begin to value what is harder to fake: depth, observation, ease, honesty, presence. That is where good conversation lives. Not in having the perfect anecdote, not in being quick, not in dominating the room. In knowing how to notice what is alive in another person and caring enough to stay with it. And the beautiful part is this: when you are truly interested, you do not have to panic about what comes next. The next thing usually reveals itself. They mention a place, a person, a turning point, a frustration, a memory. You hear the thread and you follow it. One question, one reflection, one small moment of recognition. That is enough. You do not need to light up the whole sky. You just need to keep one real flame going. And often, that flame begins the moment you stop trying to leave an impression and start letting another person leave one on you. One of the simplest ways to keep a conversation alive is also one of the least glamorous. Notice what the other person cares about more than how they present themselves. Those are not always the same thing. People often present one thing and care about another. They present confidence, but care deeply about being understood. They present busyness, but care about peace. They present humor, but are quietly carrying disappointment. They present competence, but long for relief. If you only respond to the surface, the conversation stays on the surface. But if you can hear what matters underneath, everything changes. Someone says, "Yeah, work's been a lot lately." Most people respond to the obvious part, work. But sometimes the real subject is not work. It is strain, pressure, fatigue, identity, a fear they are getting older and do not want the next decade to feel like the last one. That is why the same sentence can lead to two completely different conversations. One stays factual, the other becomes human. And the difference often comes down to this: are you listening for content, or are you listening for meaning? Content tells you what happened, meaning tells you why it matters. That is where the richer conversation is hiding. This matters especially with adults over 40, because people at this stage of life often speak in compressed ways. They do not always hand you the full story. They have learned to condense, to protect energy, to speak in summaries, to carry things privately. So if you want to connect well, you have to become better at hearing what is implied, not just what is stated, not in an intrusive way, in a human way. You hear the slight hesitation, you notice where their voice softens, you catch the line they almost brushed past, you sense where something has more emotional weight than the sentence alone would suggest. That is where your next question lives. Not in your mental list of topics, in the place where the person came slightly more alive. That is why good conversation often feels less like inventing and more like uncovering. You are not dragging words out of nowhere. You are finding what already has heat in it and giving it a little more air. And once you understand that, you stop fearing small talk so much, because even small talk contains clues. A passing mention of a trip, a throwaway comment about sleep, a joke about getting old, a brief remark about grown kids, about weekends, about health, about home repairs, about music they still listen to from 30 years ago. None of that is trivial if you know how to stay with it. A lot of meaningful conversation begins in ordinary language. That is important to remember because people sometimes think deep connection requires dramatic subjects. It does not. It often begins with everyday details handled with real attention. Someone mentions they have been waking up earlier lately. You could let that pass, or you could ask what changed. Someone says they do not go downtown much anymore. You could nod and move on. Or you could ask whether that is by choice or just life-changing shape. Someone says, "My daughter called me out of the blue last night." You could say, "Oh, nice." Or you could ask, "How did that feel?" That last kind of question opens a different door. Because now you are not just discussing events. You are touching experience. And experience is where people live. That is what many conversations miss. They trade facts without ever touching the person's inner life. And after a while, that gets tiring. It feels like eating without tasting. You finish the interaction, but nothing in you was nourished by it. So if you want to stop running out of things to say, train yourself to listen for what is most alive, not just what is most obvious. You do not need to be intense. You do not need to become someone else. You just need to notice a little more carefully and respond a little more honestly. In many ways, conversation is less about verbal skill than emotional attention. People do not open because you had the perfect line. They open because something in your attention told them, you can bring more of yourself here. And once that happens, the conversation begins to move on its own. There is one more thing people need to understand if they want conversations to feel natural again. Not every silence is a problem. A lot of people carry that belief without realizing it. The second a pause appears, they feel pressure rise in the body. They assume something is going wrong. They rush to fill the space with a random question, a safer topic, a joke that does not belong there, anything to keep the moment from going blank. But that panic is often what breaks the rhythm, because some pauses are not empty. They are full of thought, full of feeling, full of a person deciding whether to say something more honest than they planned to say. And if you interrupt that kind of silence too quickly, you do not save the conversation. You cut it off just before it deepens. That is why people who are good at conversation usually have a different relationship with pauses. They do not worship them. They do not force them. They just are not afraid of them. They know a pause can mean the other person is remembering something, or choosing their words carefully, or feeling what they just admitted, or waiting to see whether you are comfortable enough to stay present without rushing them. That last part matters more than most people realize. When you can stay calm inside a brief silence, you communicate something powerful without saying a word. I do not need to control this moment. I can stay here with you. That creates safety, and safety creates better conversation than cleverness ever will. Think about the best listeners you have known. Chances are they did not only ask good questions, they also knew how to leave room after the answer. They did not jump in too fast. They did not crowd the moment, they gave the other person a second to hear themselves. That is rare now. Most people are not listening for what wants to emerge. They are listening for the first chance to take the wheel again. And because of that, conversations often stay one layer above where they could have gone. A pause is sometimes the bridge to that next layer, especially with people over 40, because by this point in life, many truths do not come out quickly. They come out slowly, carefully, sideways sometimes. A person circles the thing before naming it. They mention the edge of it before the center. They test the room before they step into honesty. If you are patient enough, they often will. But patience is the price, and that patience does something to you too. It helps you stop treating conversation like a task to complete. It becomes less about keeping momentum and more about staying connected to what is real. Less about what should I say next, and more about what is this moment asking for. Sometimes it asks for a question. Sometimes it asks for a simple reflection. Sometimes it asks for a small story of your own, and sometimes it asks for nothing at all except presence. That is a mature kind of conversation, not performative, not restless, not addicted to constant output, just steady enough to let something human unfold. This is part of why many people become better conversationalists later in life if they are willing to learn. They begin to realize they do not have to impress every room. They do not have to win every silence. They do not have to prove they are engaging every second. They can relax their grip. They can trust the pace. They can stop treating every pause like a verdict on their worth. And when that fear loosens, words come back differently, more cleanly, more honestly, more in rhythm with the moment. So if you are someone who often feels like you run out of things to say, maybe the issue is not that your mind is empty. Maybe your fear is too loud. Maybe the silence is not exposing your lack. Maybe it is simply offering a doorway you have not learned to walk through yet. And once you stop fighting every pause, conversation begins to feel less like survival and more like being with another human being. If you're still here with me, that probably means something in this video has stayed with you. So subscribe to the channel and stay close. We're here every day for conversations like this, thoughtful, honest, and meant to last longer than a few seconds. Because if this speaks to you, you're probably not looking for louder voices. You're looking for clearer ones, for something quieter, something real. Now let's return to what matters most here. The reason most people run out of things to say is not that they lack vocabulary. It is not that they are too quiet. It is not even that they are bad with people. More often, they are just trapped in the wrong goal. They are trying to avoid awkwardness, trying to sound interesting, trying to be liked, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying to keep the whole interaction afloat by force. That is too much weight for a human moment. Real conversation gets lighter the moment you stop trying to control the whole experience. Ask a better question. Listen a little longer. Notice where the person comes alive. Do not rush the silence. Say one thing that is real. Stay curious. That is usually enough. And the strange part is, once you begin living this way, you start seeing conversations differently everywhere. In your marriage, with your kids, with old friends, with people you only meet once, even with the person at the checkout counter who says one ordinary sentence in a tone that tells you they are carrying more than groceries today. You begin to realize that most people are not hard to talk to. They are hard to reach when you stay on the surface. Because under the routine answers, under the practiced politeness, under the social habits people wear without thinking, there is almost always something more human waiting. A frustration, a hope, a memory, a loneliness, a joy they did not expect to feel, a question they have been carrying quietly for years. And no, you are not responsible for pulling that out of everyone. But if you can become the kind of person who makes space for it, you will almost never feel as helpless in conversation as you once did. That is the deeper shift. You stop thinking of conversation as something you must produce. You begin to understand it as something you enter, something you notice, something you join, something you help uncover. And when you do that, the pressure changes shape. You no longer need a script for every room. You no longer need to fear every pause. You no longer need to walk in already armed with stories and clever lines. Because now you know what to trust. Not performance, attention, not charm, presence, not having more to say than everyone else, but being willing to stay long enough for something real to be said. And once you learn that, you do not just become easier to talk to. You become someone people remember for reasons they may not even be able to explain. Maybe that is where we should end. Not with the idea that you now know how to keep every conversation alive, but with something quieter than that. The understanding that running out of things to say was never the deepest problem. For most people, the deeper problem was fear. Fear of silence. Fear of being seen struggling. Fear of seeming dull. Fear of reaching and finding nothing there. Fear that if the moment went still, it would reveal something uncomfortable about who they are. But silence has a way of teaching a different lesson when you stop fighting it. It shows you that connection was never built by constant talking. It was built by attention, by patience, by the courage to stay in the room without needing to dominate it. And maybe that is why some conversations stay with you for years, even when you can barely remember the words. Because what lingered was not the sentence itself. It was the feeling of being met, of not being rushed, of not needing to perform, of being allowed for a few minutes to exist without polishing every edge. That is rarer than people admit. And once you become someone who can offer that, your words begin to matter differently, not because they are sharper, because they are cleaner, not because you learned how to impress people, because you learned how to stop standing in the way of the moment. So the next time you feel that old pressure rising, the next time the pause comes, the next time your mind reaches for something clever and finds only noise, do less, look again, listen again. Stay one breath longer than your fear wants to stay. Let the other person finish becoming what they are trying to say. Let yourself arrive too. Because the people who never seem to run out of things to say are usually not the ones speaking the most. They are the ones who learned how to remain, and maybe that is all a good conversation has ever really been. Two people remaining long enough for something real to appear. If this video stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and share it with 5 people who might need it too. And if you want, leave a sincere comment below. Tell me what part of this touched something in you, or tell me what subject you want us to talk about in the next video.